Hey guys, John O'Brien here, video professor, Jamestown Community College, State University of New York, History 1520 on the clampdown with you one more week. So, look students, I'm sure you've gotten the news. This modality is going to continue for the rest of the spring 2020 semester. My heartfelt sympathies to those of you who look forward to in-person graduation in May. That's been postponed. We really need to hunker down here. 14 cases in Chautauqua County have been detected of COVID-19. There's likely many more. The best thing you can do is stay home, stay away from people. If you need to go outside, as we've been saying for a while, wear a mask. Heavy cloth mask, there's ways to make acceptable ones on the internet. They may not protect you entirely if someone sneezes at you, but they will protect other people from you, and you may be sick and not know it, right? So many people are spreading this virus asymptomatically without showing symptoms, right? So put on a mask. It's kind of a cultural hurdle we need to overcome here in the West, but let's take that lesson from our friends in East Asia and help to stop the spread of this thing and flatten the curve, flatten the wave, so we can get together again in the summer. Make sure you're keeping up on current events. We're all in this together, and this is worldwide. That's why they call it a pandemic. And you and I are on this together as well. So let's try to work through this. Let's try to work through History 1520. Your education is important. We are going to get through this, and we're going to need smart people on the other side of this wave, right? We're going to need you folks to get your coursework done, your degrees, get on, and get this economy moving once again. I hate to tell you that our topic today is chapter 34, which is kind of the age of anxiety, right? This interwar period between 1919, the close of World War I, the Great War, at least the Treaty of Versailles, the failed Treaty of Versailles, and the start of World War II. At least initially, from a Western perspective anyway, over the same ground, okay? That's certainly not including, as we should, the Japanese invasion of China dating to 1937. Okay? At least in the Western world, war begins in some ways over the same ground, right? That the World War I had been fought over, and the Second World War will take many more lives. So we do have people, maybe even someone watching this who has a living memory of World War II. Those of us who are younger kind of were living in the myth that we get through a lifetime without great tragedies, great international crises. Well, rarely has that been the case historically. Okay, here we are in the midst of a pandemic. Look, if your grandparents, your great-grandparents made it through the Great Depression, okay, stuff in this topic, World War II, you and I can make it through this COVID thing. So hang tough, folks. All right, hang tough. Age of anxiety. Don't be too nervous over this, right? Consequences of World War I. Well, okay, pandemic, 1918 to 1919. This was misnamed the Spanish flu. Had nothing to do with Spain, other than Spain was not involved in World War I, so it was actually producing fairly accurate mortality rates for this avian flu. I believe it was H1N5, not that matters to probably anyone watching this. But we think it actually started in Kansas, in a U.S. Army barracks, where a cook got sick, and the soldiers got sick, and then some of them went to Europe, and this is a scary thing, but this pathogen mutated to become more virulent, more deadly, especially in the trenches of the Western Front. It spread to both sides in the war, it spread beyond soldiers to civilians in places, look as far away as India, which would have a very high mortality rate. We don't know how many people died, 30, 40 million. It's huge, huge. That's 3 or 4 times the number that died in the war itself. There were cases in Jamestown, New York, where I'm kind of sort of broadcasting from. I know that Jamestown had a municipal hospital as well as a kind of sectarian Women's Christian Association hospital. I know more about the municipal or general hospital where patients were actually indigent or poor patients were treated for free in the Spanish flu epidemic. And they actually, guess what? They closed schools, okay? They wore masks. They kept their physical distance. So this is not the same thing. They didn't entirely shut down the economy like we're trying to do, but we can learn from the past, okay? We can't learn from the past. So let's keep our physical distance, even though hopefully here we are socially connected, right? The war will also bring about the disintegration of European empires. German Empire, goodbye. Where's the Kaiser? He's abdicated. He's retired and moved to the Netherlands. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's gone. Okay, it's gone. We have an Austria, we have a Hungary, we have these smaller break-off nations. We have Yugoslavia in the south, part of which had come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire, likewise, is gone. Sultans, they're gone. Mustafa Kemal, we talked about in the last lecture, Ataturk Kemal becomes essentially president of a secular, westernizing Turkey. Perhaps not unlike what we saw with the Meiji Restoration in Japan, in some respects, back in 1867, right? It becomes more westernized, more industrialized. Although in this case, Kemal was not a sultan. It's a secular state. Russia, probably the biggest changes experienced there, right? The Romanov dynasty is overthrown after hundreds of years. The Bolsheviks will actually execute the remaining members of the Tsarist family. They create a one-party dictatorship through the midst of a very, very awful civil war. I guess all civil wars are awful, right? But a very awful civil war, the Reds against the Whites in the Russian Civil War, and they implemented dictatorship. Okay? It's supposed to be of the proletariat, of the working class, but it's a dictatorship of one party. The party became the state. The party became the government, okay, with no elections, no real elections anyway. Until 1991, until actually after 1991. Treaty of Versailles will be a failure. Somewhat understandably, look, if we need to remove ourselves from our own zeitgeist here, 100 years plus later, I go back into the mindset of the French and the British. Look, almost no French family had not lost a member of their family. Every French family almost had lost a member of its family. Right? France was devastated. The French want the Germans to pay for the war. The French will blame Germany for starting the war, a war that we know as historians had many, many causes, very complicated causes, not to be blamed on Germany. But Germany will have to pay reparations, and when Germany suffering from the loss in the war, a revolution, and almost communist revolution in Germany, not successful, but a weak democratic government can't pay the reparations. The French and the Belgians send in the troops to occupy part of Germany. The Germans respond by printing money, basically, which just drives you think our economy is looking bad now. Imagine the German economy in the early 1920s, this massive, massive hyperinflation. When we see pictures of people with wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread, that's not from the Great Depression, that's actually from the early 1920s, okay? When the German government responded to the occupation of the Ruhr, that's a valley, industrial valley in Germany, by just printing money. So many, many mistakes were made, and the United States is not there to engage in any high level of diplomacy to solve these problems. I mean, that was Wilson's hope, right? That the United States would be a member of the League of Nations, that would help countries to sort out their differences after the tempers had cooled, prevent a future war. The United States is not there. The United States is the greatest power in the world by 1919, 1920. Okay? So this great power did not live up to its great responsibilities. And I think the administrations that followed Wilson, frankly, didn't understand the massive shift in power that had taken place, okay? Especially under the Coolidge administration. Coolidge had been governor of Massachusetts. He didn't have that much experience in high governance, okay? And becomes kind of a business-friendly president after the death in 1923 of Warren Harding. So failure of the League of Nations and the role the United States played in that failure. This is actually a photo of the League of Nations. Photo that's probably really difficult to see it's hard for me to see, of Europe. Just a change to Europe, okay? We as historians study change. Culturally, post-war pessimism. We can see it in the literature of the era. You might be most familiar with people like Ernest Hemingway, who served on the Italian front as an ambulance driver in this war. It's great stuff, at least kind of in a early 20th century macho kind of way, Me Too, before the Me Too era. It doesn't play that well in the 21st century years, to be honest with you. It's kind of a bit of misogyny there. But nonetheless, Wartime experience, we see this pessimism, all quiet on the Western Front, okay, in many works from many different peoples, lands who've been in the war, shows that there's just pessimism, that somehow the leaders had sold them out. The leaders said, go off to war, it's glorious, and it was hell on earth. And for the survivors, there's this great cynicism and pessimism. We see it in religion as well. There's great religious uncertainty. How could God allow this to happen type thinking. There'll be attacks on progress, right? Since the mid-18th century, Europe is going to progress through reason and science, but this war showed the lack of rationality. It showed how industrial progress anyway could lead to mass slaughter. So there's this loss of faith in progress, this great attempts to explain what had happened. We will see revolutions in physics and psychology. Also upsetting to find out Newton wasn't entirely right. I mean, we thought Newton explained everything. Didn't gravity explain everything in physics? Well, no, not at the subatomic level. What's that? Well, new ways of thinking, right? At the very, very smallest level of material, okay, the atomic level. Subatomic level, where Newtonian physics aren't going to work. They start to be explained by people who understood this stuff, not people like me. Okay, psychology. Freud. Okay, Freud had actually done most of his work in Vienna with middle class, especially women. And his ideas about the id and the ego and the superego, how we are not rational beings, really came into vogue in the 1920s. They seemed to help explain the war, reason for the war, and its aftermath. Okay, so this is a great intellectual fermentation after the war. Okay? When civilization had almost collapsed, it seemed, in Europe, there's great thinking about how that might have happened. Okay? There's great experimentation in art and architecture. It's always hard to lecture on art and architecture, okay? But the Bauhaus movement in Germany, this kind of Weimar, urbanity, really cool stuff. We'll look that up sometime. Picasso, showing different perspectives on the same portraits, the demoiselles here. Avignon, I forgot now where they're from. But kind of like, this was art, this was really upsetting to many viewers. And then, by the end of the 1920s, this great age of really pessimism that we don't get from looking through popular culture. Wasn't it the jazz age? Wasn't it the great age? No. For Americans, some Americans, for white Americans, for urban Americans, times might have been good, okay? But not for farmers in this country, not for African Americans in this country, not for other minorities in this country. Women get the right to vote. Okay, there's score one, all right? One step forward, okay? Feminism becomes one of the successful isms of the era. But the Great Depression will set in. There was great borrowing through the 1920s. There was a great age of consumerism, mass production. And along with this mass production is the new mentality of buy now, pay later. Okay? So put things on credit. They didn't have credit cards, but we get the idea. Buy things on credit, pay it off later. Well, individuals were even buying stocks on credit. So if I'm the stockbroker and I say, hey, here's 1,000 shares of Ford Motor Company, let's pretend it's $1,000, and you only have $100, give me the 100, I'll give you 1,000 shares worth of Ford, and you can pay me the other 900. Because we know that's going to keep rising, right? Isn't the stock market always going to keep rising? Look over the last 3 weeks, folks. Okay, you'll see that no, it's not inexorable. And it crashed, right? And if you had borrowed $900 from me, essentially, and the stock's going down in value, you have to just sell quickly. You're going to sell that 1,000 shares before it drops below 900. And if everyone sells at the same time, there's going to be massive problems. Although the Great Crash did not cause the Great Depression. The Great Crash in October of 1929 did not cause the Great Depression. It was a symptom of it. The real cause was overproduction. Industrial nations were producing more than people could purchase. One way to ease that would have been for workers who have earned more. Okay? Instead of for industrialists to invest more and more, their money in more and more factories and machinery to actually give their workers more money. That could have alleviated the Great Depression. Okay? But people didn't have enough money to buy things outright. They'd buy things in credit. Okay? And eventually, Look, you might buy a Model A in 1927, but you're not going to buy another one in 1928 or 1929, right? You don't need to keep purchasing these durable goods. Nations, as the Great Depression set in, as factories closed and people were furloughed or laid off or fired, they're not going to buy things, okay? And there's a vicious cycle, okay? So imagine that you're working for Ford Motor Company. You're a man, you're married, because married women, if they were white, they were not working. African American women often forced to work, especially inside their own home for others. But let's imagine you're a white family in River Rouge, outside of Detroit, Michigan. Your name is Joe. You come home and you put your lunchbox on the kitchen table and you say, "Well, honey, just been laid off." And she's like, "What does that mean?" "Well, we're not going to make cars for a while till what we have sells." "How long will that be?" "Don't know." And she goes to the cookie jar and says, "Well, this $50 we were saving to buy a vacuum cleaner, we can't do that now." So the next day, the guy at the vacuum cleaner company gets laid off, right? And he goes home in the same situation, and his wife says, "Well, this $30 we had saved, we can't buy a radio now." The guy at the radio company gets laid off. See how this is a vicious cycle down. Okay? And there's a lack of a safety net. Banks went out of business. There was no FDIC. Next time you get out of your homes and go to a bank, you'll see that Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insures your money. There's insurance on your money. If somehow that bank went out of business, which would almost be impossible, even in these tough times now, the government inspects the banks, does audits, etc. The owner just can't, the bank manager just can't run off to Tahiti or something with all your money. You'd get it back somehow if that had happened, all right, from the government. But that didn't exist then. Your money in the bank, if the bank closed and never opened again, your money was gone. Okay, so you see these great lines of people. Not here. These guys are lining up for coffee and donuts. They're out of work. So bank failures. Lack of a safety net. Why are these guys, look, oh man, right? This is free coffee and donuts for the employee. Well, this probably stretches way down the block. There was no safety net. There was no stimulus package by the government. There was no get a grant and go to JCC and learn some other skill, or get educated for some other type of job. There was no welfare. There was no Social Security. There was no unemployment. There was what? Your Salvation Army, maybe your church. Well, soon they're going to be overwhelmed, right? Massive, massive unemployment. Although, ironically, we're approaching that right now, hopefully only for the short term. But unemployment reached levels of about 25% during the Great Depression. And if we get to that level now, we can't really equate it, because during the Great Depression, a number of farm agricultural workers are out of work, not really counted. That really meant that 25% of American households had no income. Today, we're in a situation where often, if there are two adults in the home, they both work. Okay? And if one is unemployed, maybe the other is still working. So it's tough to equate the unemployment rates from the early 1930s with today. So if we start to approach 30, 35, 40%, I think that's more comparable. Okay? Although our government has learned some things from this disaster of the 1930s. Few jobs available. So in that era, unlike perhaps today, if you or some of your family members have been laid off, I hope that person is not blaming him or herself, right? They didn't cause the COVID-19 virus. This is a pathogen, right? But in this era, when a factory closed, men of a different generation often blame themselves. They blame themselves. They go looking for work. There was none. Some would hop on a train and go around the country, maybe never come back again. There were no jobs. Very, very few jobs, okay? So massive unemployment. Economic nationalism. Nations will start to close the doors of trade to foreign powers, meaning we're not going to buy stuff from other countries. We'll preserve American jobs by not buying stuff from Canada or Europe. Well, guess what? They stopped buying things from the United States, and that led to job losses in this country. So the Smoot-Hawley tariff is an egregious example of that. What are governments going to do? Well, the Weimar Republic in Germany, a democracy, the Social Democrats really did not know what to do. It was a weak democracy after World War I, burdened by the Treaty of Versailles.